Hello and welcome to Journalist Hangout UK, the show where we discuss issues, both African and worldwide, which are affecting the continent. And we look at how those issues are seen at home and in the African diaspora. I'm effervescent, and I am pleased to welcome our panel, Lanre Akinola, editor of African Business, Priscilla Nwipo, public affairs analyst, and Tanzanka Jo, journalist and broadcaster. Welcome, everybody. And it's been another eventful week. We've seen strong hints that Zuma is about to step down in South Africa, the EU intervening in Anglophone Cameroon, and the new Nigerian World Cup football jersey causing a storm on social media. But sticking with Nigeria, it's a year to go until elections. It feels like they could be only a week away. The campaigning is really beginning in earnest, isn't it, Priscilla? What are your thoughts about the elections so far?
Oh wow! I think the most interesting thing is having the two generals writing to the current president and giving their 2 pence worth of advice, as it were, as per his aspirations, if he has any.
So you are talking about Babangida and Obasanjo?
Absolutely, yes. They thought they should throw their 2 pence in. So it's quite interesting having them speak at this point. And it's also quite interesting hearing them say we should no longer have analog leadership, but we should now look for younger people that would run the country. I think it's interesting.
Tam, what are your thoughts?
I think it's exciting because you are seeing the democracy in Nigeria, ripening up, becoming more mature. Everyone realizing that as long as you are a citizen and you have reached that legal age of majority, you can run for office. So it's no longer a question of whether President Buhari will run again or if he will win. There are so many candidates. This is a country, the largest country in Africa when you talk about population. So we should have thousands of potential presidential candidates, and that is healthy for democracy.
That's something to look forward to. Lanre?
Well, it reminds me a bit of one of my favorite movies, The Usual Suspects. It's the same names over and over again. I feel like we could do with some fresh names, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
We will. Well, Buhari, we don't yet know if he'll be standing for another term. Priscilla, is it realistic that he could try? He's been beset by health problems throughout this term, and there's mounting criticism of the reforms that he promised that have really lost momentum.
I mean, as I've said so many times over and over, for the sake of his health, I think it's important for him to consider that if he is at all considering running for 2019, because I think that his absence, because of his health, has a great impact on the country, and it's not wise at this point, and in the Nigerian democracy, to have a leader that is now going to take such a long absence, because of his health. And like you said, as the two generals, I'm probably going to continually refer to both of them today, as they both asked the question, where is the change that we voted for? What they are effectively saying is that he hasn't delivered on his promises. He hasn't delivered on his campaign, and therefore, if that's not happening, then perhaps he should reconsider if he was thinking about running. And I also think that his age, equally, Nigeria is a huge country. Nigeria, the pressures of the office is going to have a great impact on him. So if he was considering running again for 2019, perhaps it's not a good idea.
Lanre, does the intervention of former President Babangida actually make any difference? I mean, he's urging Buhari to step aside. How much influence will that really have?
It's difficult to say. Few people know what really goes on behind the scenes in elite Nigerian politics. This is not really a new phenomenon. It tends to happen in every presidential election cycle. The old power brokers, the people who pull some of the strings, come out and will say things to obviously try to influence the outcome. I don't know is the answer. It'll be interesting to see. I would say that Nigeria is a task that is beyond the capacity of any single administration. I think even under ideal circumstances, Buhari would have struggled to make much by way of inroads into the country's problems. So I'm not convinced that it's necessarily a good idea for him to leave now. It feels like they might finally be actually hitting a bit of a stride in terms of trying to push the country in a certain direction. But we'll see.
Sam, one thing some people have said is that Buhari has made some headway in what's sometimes called the carnival of corruption in Nigeria, which is probably a phrase you're familiar with, given Zimbabwe's history. Do you feel that there has been progress in tackling corruption in Nigeria? Is that something that maybe, as Lamre is saying, could fuel another run for office from Buhari?
There's definitely been progress, and that progress has come in the form of the government taking a lead and talking about it. Because Nigeria is such a big country, there's corruption that has been going on for a very long time in different departments. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is government only. It can be in all the other, maybe social, even some of the religious churches, and even at village level. So I think getting Abuja administration to talk about it was a good start. But then when you go back, there are people we've been talking to in Nigeria, some of whom will say, well, former President Babangida is the man that took out President Buhari in the 80s in coming in. So if he intervenes and say Buhari should give way to a younger generation, that is not going to be a surprise. With former President Obasanjo, they're also saying, well, there are people around him who wanted him to stay beyond the 2 terms in office even. So this will be an irony. But then both men have an opportunity to reflect on issues of leadership, and will be saying that they are speaking because of the national interest. But President Buhari will know himself if he is going to make a contribution to Nigeria. One thing that I will remember very well is when he was unwell, as soon as he left London to go back to Nigeria, he did say that something that was deep down his heart was about education. And he did say that if it was a case that he was not able to continue, Nigeria or whoever is in administration should make sure that education is sorted. So if he goes for a second term, I think he will be wanting to do something about education to make sure that every child in Nigeria has an opportunity to get education. But then again, in the main of, I think, in a democracy, everyone should be able to put themselves forward as a candidate. And if people want to vote for them, then people will vote for them. If people don't want to vote for him for health or whether he's delivered or not, then that is an option for Nigerian voters.
It's interesting that you raise education, and there's probably no candidate who's going to disagree that education is important for Nigeria. But are we going to see all of these candidates running on a broad developmental platform? Are we going to see any actual political ideology in this election? Tam talked about democracy ripening in Nigeria, it being a positive thing that there will be so many candidates, so much campaigning. But will there be any actual politics, or is this going to be the kind of the old factionalism of political parties and regions and ethnic identities in Nigeria, Priscilla?
One of the things that unfortunately Nigerian politics is devoid of is ideology. And I think we see that not just in Nigeria, but right across Africa. And I see a growth. For me, I've always said the revolution's probably started in 2011, and it's been building slowly. The Nigerian masses are becoming more aware now. They're beginning to engage. And I think it is only when they engage that we're going to be able to see that change, where we are more looking at ideology and less of, the ethnic side of things and the clan side of things, as you put it. Up until that point, we're going to continue to see people just coming in and just coming on a broad developmental platform, because it's always about, we're going to build infrastructure, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And yes, even with the ideology, it's the same. But by now, we should have, made taking better leaps forward and going ahead. We're highly educated people. Yes, our educational system is not the best, but we're highly educated people. And by now, we should be able to be taking the right steps towards having real politics, having real political conversations. But that is lacking because twofold. We don't educate the masses. on the need for the political education is not there in the first instance. And those who are also, vying for these offices are equally not educated in that realm of understanding that, it's not just about where I come from, it's not just about my people, but it's a lot more than that.
This is the kind of healthy development of democracy, isn't it, Lanre? It's politics reflecting the people in the democracy. It's all rough and tumble. It's a kind of learning the hard way. Should we celebrate this as the kind of ordinary cacophony of an election in a large and very dynamic country?
That's a big question. It's difficult to say. I would suggest to you that there are some quite serious issues around meaningful representation in Nigeria, not just in Nigeria, across the board. Democracy is a word. Unless you have the commensurate institutions that go with that make for, and I stress this, meaningful representation, it remains a word. You can say the same about many developed economies these days, where effectively what you're doing is choosing one elite faction over another. You're not actually particularly involved in the process. And for all the bluster and for all the noise that comes out of Nigeria, I'm sorry to say, I'm not convinced that what we're seeing is a meaningful move towards democracy, because it is still the usual suspects who control elite coalitions that have no ideology, and they jump back and forth between them, which we saw at the last election. We're seeing some of it in this election. So
I don't agree that it's not a meaningful effort towards democracy. I think it is, because where you now have an awakening of the people, there are more conversations on social media. People are beginning to learn, and interestingly, during this season, what we're also seeing are, like you mentioned, the religious institutions now are now advocating and admonishing their flocks, go out and get your PVC. So I think that's a start towards
you can see how much there is to say on this topic. We have to take a quick break now, but we will be back with plenty more to discuss. So please join us in a few moments. Hello and welcome back to Journalist Hangout UK. I'm Efwa Hirsch and I'm pleased to welcome back our panel, Lanre Akinola, Priscilla Nwikpo and Tamsanka Jo. Welcome back everyone. We're talking about something now that might sound a little bit dry, but it's actually, when you look at the figures, so important. I'm going to come to you first, Lanre. The figures I have are that median debt in sub-Saharan Africa rose from 34% 5 years ago to 48% last year. And in Ghana and a number of other countries, it's at 50%. This really rings alarm bells about the fundamental health of important African economies, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm glad we're finally talking about this, because Africa's next debt crisis has been in the works for at least a couple of years. It is coming. The expected average debt burden, public debt burden, is going to hit 53% this year, which by global standards isn't very high. Places like the US, France, Japan, Germany have much higher debt levels than sub-Saharan Africa, but that's not the issue. The issue is the ability to service that debt and what the borrowing is being used for. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the problem is twofold. One, Ghana is already spending 35% of government revenues to service its debt. And two, what you're having is the equivalent of people using countries using one credit card to pay off another credit card. And we've been here before. One last thing, there's a lot to be said on this topic, is that this time it's not just public debt. Countries are running back to the IMF. 20 countries have taken out IMF bailout packages since 2012. In Tunisia, there are already protests over austerity. Egypt is constantly on the brink of protests. It's taken out a $12 billion aid package. Gabon has, Cameroon has. Zambia is desperately trying to get an IMF bailout at the moment. There's talk that it can't even pay its civil servants if it doesn't get it. It's been trying to do so for a year. The other issue, and I'll end on this for now, is private debt. Governments have have piled on private debt in recent years because interest rates have been at a historic low. And just one statistic, $35 billion of Eurobond debt is going to mature in the next 5 to 6 years. It is very unlikely that many countries will be able to pay this back. Mozambique's already in a full-blown debt crisis. I could go on for the next half hour, but I know we don't have the time.
That, Tam, is a seriously sobering picture, isn't it?
Well, on one end, but it can also be good news on the other.
I'm looking forward to hearing this.
Right, so the good news will probably to start off in Ghana and in Tanzania, where in Ghana, now Addo is basically saying there's no reason why Africa should be borrowing anyway in the very first place, because Africa has all the resources. It is about the terms of those contracts. So these are commercial agreements. When Landro was talking about the debt that needs to be paid and whether that debt is actually being serviced, what were the terms? So what is the point in having a country that is as rich as Zimbabwe or Ghana or Tanzania or even Chad, for instance, going out to borrow money and saying they're going to pay it back for maybe 15, 20%, when that very country can use the resources that it has. I mean, Chad was talking about 94 billion in 10 years that has been siphoned out of the country. And you find, so why would that country be in debt? So for me, I think it is an opportunity for these countries. I know Zimbabwe, for instance, they were talking about this when they went to Davos and said anyone that goes into Zimbabwe now will need to play ball in terms of fair contracts to that country. You're not just going to throw money and have these governments receiving without looking at what it will do to next generations.
And there's, of course, the potential to do things differently in future. But Priscilla, this is a reminder, as Alamre was saying, isn't it, that to fund these developmental programs they've been promising voters, governments have been borrowing money. They've been building these roads and hospitals and schools with debt, which now they are paying a third of their income to repay. I mean, that is a problem that's being shored up for the next generation, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think this situation has arisen because of African leaders' lack of taking responsibility for the people that they govern and taking responsibility for the next generation. As Tam mentioned there, these countries are so rich. And it's an opportunity for them now to look back at some of the contracts that they have. Because why would you, Ghana, for instance, I recall when Ghana found oil and Ghana was saying they were not going to go in the same direction as Nigeria. And what is the story today? I mean, it's ridiculous. You would have thought that Ghana would have learned from Nigeria, as they said, and signed a contract that would be more beneficial, especially when we have the situation that we have with the gold situation already as it is now. They would have signed and we're talking, when was it? 2020 what?
10.
Exactly. So why would you sign a contract in that time that would be less beneficial to Ghanaians and then put you in a situation where you're having to go for debt? It wasn't so long ago that Ghana, also went out for their IMF bailout. So I think that it's African leaders need to begin to take responsibility now for the next generation, but they have the population. That's the other thing. They have the population, and it takes for them to sit upright and begin to do right within the countries. I believe they can sufficiently raise enough funds to be able to not just service these debts, but build better economies.
But this is a vicious cycle, isn't it, Lamre? Because this debt is now having to be repaid, and as well as the strain on the budget, that's also making these economies much less attractive to future investors.
Not
surely.
only is the current debt reaching unsustainable levels in terms of servicing, but what's happening is that much of the money that's being borrowed is not being borrowed to build roads, it's being borrowed to plug budget deficits. What that means is governments are spending more than they are raising. This includes Ghana. Now, I respectfully disagree with both of my other panelists that these countries are rich. They are in principle rich. They are not rich. Most governments across Africa are literally broke. George Weah came out the other week and said we are broke. He's one of the few who's honest enough to admit it. Deficits are widening across the board. We haven't spoken about Kenya. Even the IMF, which is in the business of giving debt to African countries has started warning. It's warned Kenya, it's warned Uganda, it's issued overall warnings. The World Bank, in its most recent growth forecast for the region, issued a warning on debt. And the big thing that we haven't spoken about is global interest rates. The servicing levels at the moment, sooner or later, interest rates are going to go up, which means all of this debt is going to become even more expensive.
And probably sooner from what we're hearing this week.
Yeah.
I know I'm going to be, labeled as the negative one on the panel, but the reality is the debt crisis is coming, and many countries are in for a very rough ride over the next decade or so.
I'm not labeling you, but the IMF always puts out a warning, but it never stops them.
Its job is to issue debt, so
it never stops them from issuing the kind of debts that they do.
I would say the reason why my view is different is because when you have a country, let me take Zimbabwe as an example. The former president Robert Mugabe did say that within the last few years, $15 billion that should have been coming from the country's diamonds. Remember, when the country is under sanctions, he was talking about there's $15 billion that should have come to Treasury. What is Zimbabwe's debt? $10 billion. So within 1 year, that debt that Zimbabwe has, which continues to balloon because of the interest rates, could have been paid from just those diamond proceeds. Before you even talk about gold, agriculture, everything else that Zimbabwe has.
They have.
So almost every country that you look at in Africa can do what Donald Trump is doing in the US to say,
in principle,
make sure you have a deal that will benefit your country and your people.
We could talk about this so much more, but I want to move on briefly to household debt because, and this isn't confined to Africa, I mean countries like the UK have had multiple warnings about unsustainable levels of household debt, but South Africa, more people have loans with financial institutions than have jobs. Lamre, that sounds like another serious problem waiting to happen.
Oh yeah, it's coming, and this is one area where much of sub-Saharan Africa is kind of lucky because household borrowing really isn't a thing outside of South Africa. South Africa is probably the one example where it is a big thing. And yes, they've gone to town. I mean, this is, people who've been paying attention have been aware of this for at least a decade. Back in even back in 2008, 2009, people were starting to warn about the levels of borrowing, personal borrowing in South Africa. That was to get new TVs, we know how it goes. And there is a bigger issue around borrowing globally, but, it's definitely unsustainable in South Africa. And luckily for once, a lack of financial inclusion is going to work in favor of a lot of other African countries where household borrowing isn't really a thing.
And at this time of year, Priscilla, South Africans probably relieve the end of January as they've started calling it. but it's not all buying new TVs, is it? There's what sometimes we refer to as the black tax, that the people who do have jobs are now having to carry a whole extended family, whether it's their school fees or their funeral costs or their own personal finance problems, and plug these gaps, and they are resorting to borrowing as well.
Absolutely. I think it's also, a problem with the South African system, because they obviously make it that easy for people to have access to finance, and really they should examine their ability to be able to pay. And
ShopRite has one of the lenders that has been criticised for irresponsible lending practices. I just want to, we're nearly out of time, but I want to bring
talking about ShopRite and then Steinhoff, and then you have the people at the top having problems themselves. But I think in addition to the debt, individual debt, you also have what you call domestic debt. So where most of the central banks will be struggling because there's so much that has been borrowed from them. So there's three levels: individual domestic debt, then internal debt as in the financial institutions and the central banks, and then external debt. So Africa is in trouble unless there is an opportunity for people like Landry and yourself to go there and say, hey guys, it's time that we do things differently. And that is not impossible.
And Ray, I'm coming to you for a last hopefully ray of hope. Can you see, are things getting so bad that things will have to dramatically change, that we will see leadership grappling with this problem?
Well, it's just a shame that, it's just over a decade ago that we had huge debt relief across the continent. And here we are again, having the same conversation. It says the lessons haven't been learned. So something clearly has to change. That's not being negative. It's coming. What's the point of pretending it's not?
Well, it's time to leave it there. We will see how this one plays out, I'm sure, over the next a few episodes. So don't forget to follow us at RealJHUK on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. I'm Efwa Hirsch, and from the entire team in London, goodbye. And thank you for watching Journalists Hangout UK.